All right, let's start reading. Let's turn our attention to the prologue of John here. And I'll be toggling back and forth between this and the version that we can really zoom in on here. But if it doesn't come up very clearly, I guess it comes up pretty good now. I've lightened it. Okay, so what you're looking at here in black and white is the opening page of P66, the title page, at what's called the Virtual Manuscript Room in Münster, Germany. Münster has the largest photographic collection of manuscripts in the entire world. They've cataloged all of them. It was started by Kurt and Barbara Alland many years ago, and it's the spot for manuscript collections. And so if you want to see what manuscripts look like and what all their features are, then this is your location. And so if I pull up the Virtual Manuscript Room, here's P66, just so you can see it on the screen. So this is the name, P66. This is the document ID number. Language, Greek, origin year. They put it about 200. It's really 175 to 225 is probably the better way to put it. 3rd century, but I think late 2nd is more likely. Content overview. It tells you all the different sections of it. Look, you've got 1:1 through 6:11, then there's a gap, 6:35 through 14, 26, then 29, then 15. So you've got a good chunk of the book here. How many leaves? 75. 1 column. This is interesting. Not all Greek manuscripts during this time were 1 column. Some of them had 2 columns if they were wider. Usually the 2 columns come later. It can help us date. Line max per page is 25. But average looks like it's about 14. This is, I believe, centimeters, height of 162 and width of 142. So it's not a very big codex. It's maybe 7 inches high and 5 inches wide. I mean, it's small. It's not that different. It's about like this. Okay, it's about like your Bible, one of those pages. So it's not a big. I don't know what's in your head visually. When you see something zoomed in, you think that thing's huge, I'd hold it like this or something. No, it's small, okay? And you're seeing that there. Now, if we pull up the P66 detail, you can see all the different photographs that are available to us. We can look at all these, and we will. You can look how much text there is. Look at this. Look at that. All the way 9, 10, 10, 11, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Man, was the complete. Wow, we almost had. Look at that. It fades out at the end. See the fragments? Aren't you glad I didn't assign those? Please repiece together this fragment. You can see how fragmentary it gets. There's not a surprise there. What's interesting about this is, aren't we glad, you can see how fragmentary these last sheets are. Aren't we glad that the preserved part, we get to have the front page preserved, which is really, like I said, rare. But usually we're missing both front and back. So we'll be looking at, obviously, both chapter 1 and chapter 7. But here it is. And then when we pull it up fully, this is the page you're looking at. But it's in black and white, and the photograph's there. And this is super high def. It looks terrible on that screen. It looks better on mine. You can zoom in really, really tight on this. So if you wanted to see the very opening line, look how close we can get here. That's crazy. Look at this. You can see that epsilon really up close. And again, the quality, unfortunately, on that screen is different from my computer. But notice this epsilon. You've got the rounded portion here. And notice the scribe likes to extend the middle portion and kind of end in a little dot right there, right? You can notice he probably just re-inked the pen because of that blob of ink right there. So you've got your N. This is your NRK, of course. Hain, Ada Nu, and then Ha Lagos. Okay, and one of the things, I'm stealing the thunder of the first reader here, obviously, but it's not a very hard text. And then you've got what looks like a C. I said this in my notes, but what looks like a C here, you're like, what's a C? But that's just the way they drew the Greek sigma in these manuscripts. The rest of the letters looks at least somewhat like their standard caps. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to read a little bit at a time here. So who's taking this for credit? Raise your hand. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you. Very few. This is going to be fun. All right, so I want to start here with Corey on the end. It's grace to you, my friend. Start with the easy first 2 lines. Look where my cursor is. See this dot? Let's read to that dot, which is a middle point in Greek, and then we'll talk about the text. So go ahead and start us off. And oh, by the way, if you've not had me for a Greek reading class, at this point, just read and then translate, and then I'll ask questions. I'll try to do the bouncing ball here if I need to point out some things.
Okay.
And you can use all your notes that you prepared with, so don't feel like you have to, stumble your way through the whole thing. If you need help, you've got it, I hope.
Okay. In arche, hein halagos, kai halagos, hein proston. I kind of filled in.
Yes, absolutely, because it's missing, isn't it? Notice this big gap right here on the screen, and if I pull up the other one, you can see it more plainly. You can see that pros, ton, theon, obviously the new's missing here, and the theon's missing here. Okay?
So do you want me to read if I put in the words?
Yeah, read the missing words, because it doesn't make sense otherwise. So you can read the implied words.
Okay. Pros, ton, theon, kai theos, hein halagos. Hutos, hein arche, pros, ton, theon. Panta di autu egenata kai.
Whoop, stop right there.
Oh,
Yeah, kai tu agenata, autu agenata. So we'll stop at that middle point right there. So this is obviously the standard opening prologue, and Corey, why don't you translate it for us?
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Through him all things came to be or were made.
All right, let's break this down a little bit. Enarche hein halagos. Notice at the very beginning here, you've got an opening line with what looks like a middle point right here on this little dot. So the scribe is almost breaking it into micro little sections at the beginning. This is interesting because so the scribe starts off a lot of punctuation, and then as he goes further, he sort of spreads it out. But you can tell he kind of started out ambitious here. In the beginning was the Word. This is the standard opening line of the Greek text. And then, of course, you've got in the beginning was Word, and the Word, kai logos, ein pros. And then you can see the to here, and then ton theon. In the beginning, the Word was with God. And then, of course, the most famous line, perhaps, in this opening line, and God was the Word, or the Word was God is the best way to put that. This, of course, is the predicate nominative situation that we go over in Gospels, and is the favorite sort of fodder for our Jehovah's Witnesses friends who want to suggest that Jesus was just a God. Not true. I talk also in Gospels, if you have me there, that the word order flip-flopping around here creates an interesting chiastic structure. Okay? So you have beginning, word, God, God, word, beginning. And this would be a very Hebraic way to begin the Gospel of John, and his readers would have no doubt observed this. Now, Corey, you started this line right here with the word he. He was in the beginning with God, and that's a fine translation. But what are other options here, particularly with hutos here?
This.
Okay, good. So notice in this particular construction, even though the word he is fine, it's really a demonstrative pronoun, hutos, right? This one, the one I just described, he was in the beginning with God. And through him, and again we have the rest of the ton theon off to the side, and I'm going to come back to the nomina sacrum in a moment. And all things through him, hata agenata. And let's parse agenata there, Corey.
It is an aorist indicative, middle third person singular.
Yeah, so this is technically a second aorist. From what word?
Genomai?
Yeah. So, and ginomai is interesting. John likes the word ginomai as a word to reference creation. This is just his little thing, right? You could use other words, obviously, but they come about, right? Nothing came about without him. All things through him happened or came about is where you end up here in line 3. And this is an interesting little way that he does things. Notice a couple other little tidbits here. Notice you're missing the alpha for dia because it's backed up onto the autou here. So this is a classic case of what's called a lesion, which you remember in your Greek text or Greek class, I trust, which is when you have two vowels side by side. Usually the first one drops out if it's after a preposition. So it's dia-autou, right? Instead of dia-autou, it's dia-autou. Notice also here you've got a very classic case of the extended middle epsilon coming out again. Notice he makes the E here with that long stroke sticking out. Just the standard practice of our scribe. And what's interesting about it is that when we sort of examine this in more detail, we'll find out that that's going to help us identify his corrections, because his corrections are going to have that same style, which suggests it's probably the guy using the similar hand. Okay, with that in mind, let's talk about this right here. This, of course, zooming in on it, is the word God, theos. And this is what we call the nomina sacra. I'm going to say more about the nomina sacra at a later point, but right now, let's just talk about this a little bit in terms of what's going on. A standard scribal abbreviation in early Christianity was the abbreviation of special names for God. Okay, and this is something Christian scribes did. Now we know that in the Old Testament, Jewish scribes did this for the word Yahweh of sorts, but they did it differently. They would write the word Yahweh without vowel points or something like that. Greek scribes have their own form of abbreviation called the nomina sacra. The nomina sacra is Latin, obviously, for sacred names. And there were 4 of them: God, Jesus, Lord, and Christ. And of course, in Greek. And so these were the 4 names originally the scribes abbreviated. And they would do it by taking the first and last letter and then take out the rest of the letters and draw a line over the top. So think of the word theos. That would be abbreviated to theta sigma with a line over the top. So they take out the middle 2 letters, take the first and the last, and they write a line over the top. This was the abbreviation theos. And if it was theou, it would be theta upsilon, right? The first and last letters. So you can see that right here. You have the theta, then you have the sigma, and you have the line over the top. This is a classic case of the nomina sacra. This is not the first nomina sacra in John. All right? The first nomina sacra in John would have been on the prior line, but we don't have it. Okay? Remember? Because he was in the beginning, he was with God. Pros, ton, theon. That would have been floating around out here, would have been the first use of the nomina sacra in John, but of course we don't have that because the page is missing in that particular section. But here we have nomina sacra with the abbreviation. And as you no doubt picked up when you were doing your Greek prep, you've got not only the nomina sacra of God in the text, but the nomina sacra of Jesus. I can't remember if there's any other examples of nomina sacra here. I don't know if there's issues of kurios or Christos in the text I assigned to you. I can't remember. But certainly these 2 are abbreviated in what you've done so far. Now, for those of you who've done the reading, what is the point of the nomina sacra? Why did scribes do this? Is bored, looking for something to do different? What's behind the nomina sacra? Yeah, number one thing that you have to understand about the nomina sacra is that scribes did it as a mark of devotion or reverence to Christ and to God. Okay? So there was a theological significance to the nomina sacra. Don't think the nomina sacra was designed to save space. Okay? Did it save space as a form of an abbreviation? Yeah, that wasn't the main intent. The main intent was to show devotion to these 4 names, to honor them. Now, what's curious about this, of course, is that these 4 names show that devotion was attributed to Jesus right alongside of God by these scribes. So when you think about it for a moment, what if you wanted to say, how do you assess earliest Christology in the church? Views of Jesus. There's lots of ways to do that. One of the most obvious ways to do that is just look at what patristic writers say about Jesus. Okay, and is he God? Is he man? What is he? Okay, we've done that 1,000 times. What if you did it a different way? What if you assessed the early views of Jesus by what scribes did with his name? If we looked at it that way, then we could see that in the 2nd century, scribes were honoring the name of Jesus alongside the name of God. That would have been very significant in telling us how high they viewed him. He is Lord. He is God. He is on that very select list. And by the way, that list did expand over time, but it always was related to God or Jesus. So there's other words that end up making it on the list. The word anthropos made it on the list at some point later. Why do you think that was the case? Son of man, exactly. The word David made it on the list at a later point. Why do you think that's the case? Son of David. The word pneuma made it on the list at a later point. No surprise there, right? The divinity of the Spirit. Built into the manuscripts is a theological sort of code, if you will. It tells us what scribes were thinking when they did this. Now, the other thing about the Nomina Sacra I'll mention here, and I'm sort of pre-lecturing my later lectures, so we can probably skip over some of it later now that I'm getting into it. The other thing about the Nomina Sacra here, what's interesting, is how widespread it was across all early manuscripts. To put it sort of bluntly, we are hard-pressed to find a New Testament manuscript that doesn't have the Nomina Sacra. So, lest you think that just the scribe of P66 thought it up, no, it is widespread. Everybody, everywhere was doing it. They were using, all the scribes were doing the same thing, basically, in all the manuscripts. In fact, even in P52, our earliest manuscript, there's indications that it had the Nomina Sacra. We can't hardly find a manuscript without it. It's widespread and incredibly early. Now, when you ask about the Nomina Sacra, you think, when did it start? Larry Hurtado has argued that it most likely started even in the 1st century. And that you might have the Nomina Sacra being done in the late 1st century, somewhere in that time period. Now, obviously, that's before this manuscript, but he suggests that it was happening almost from the very start and then spread out into a uniform practice so that it's pretty developed by the time we get to it here. That tells you a number of things. It tells you, one, people had a very high view of Jesus, even in the 1st century. But it also tells you that the scribal infrastructure of early Christianity was remarkably sophisticated and developed. And what that means is that they were organized, they were on the same page. You don't have one scribe over here doing one thing, another scribe over here doing another thing. They were sort of together in it, okay? I mean, how do you get all scribes on the same page like that? Unless you have a scribal infrastructure that's fairly well organized. So it's not just, Bob's scriptorium making copies of manuscripts in sort of this mom and pa fashion, but it seems to be fairly sophisticated and interactive. They seem to be connecting with each other. Anne?
Would they change the pronunciation as they were reading? I know in the Hebrew, they won't say Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
When they would use a theta and a sigma, was it pronounced that way or was it actually theos?
I don't know if we know how it was read publicly. That's a very interesting question. I'm sure there's been things written on what, speculating on whether they would have read the Nomina Sacra as the actual word or whether they would have pronounced the abbreviation. They would have read something, whether they said, my hunch is because the word typically is just unpronounceable without vowels, they probably would have said what the word was pointing towards. So in this sense, they probably would have said the word theos. But if you were looking at the manuscript, it would have been clear that you were dealing with a Nomina Sacra. The Nomina Sacra, then, are actually, interestingly, some of the earliest sort of visual culture of early Christianity, where they start sort of visually looking at things almost like in an artistic way. And so that you could identify a manuscript as a Christian manuscript just by seeing the Nomina Sacra in it. So if a person who couldn't even really read very well saw the display of the New Testament text or a biblical text on the sort of church pulpit, they could look at it and see the Nomina Sacra, and that would have been sort of a sign to them that this is a Christian text, this is a sacred text. Yes?
Would this be similar to how we capitalize the H in the word him, he, and that's like how we show reverence?
Yeah, I think it would be similar. I think it would go, significantly beyond that. But yes, the reason it would go beyond that is because we would capitalize other proper names, wouldn't we, in our writing? So John or Jim or Sally, we'd capitalize those too, and you capitalize God's name. Okay, so it shows a certain amount of, proper name type respect. But the nomina sacra would be similar to that, I guess, but it would be, even more of a sign of almost devotion or worship. Yep.
Is this done outside of biblical text?
It is. What's interesting is the nomina sacra not only occurs in our New Testament manuscripts, but it also occurs in apocryphal texts. And there's no surprise why that would be the case. I mean, if you were writing an apocryphal text and wanted it to be considered Christian, you would put the nomina sacra in. And so you have, apocryphal gospels including the nomina sacra, which is pretty interesting. It was just the way you wrote Christian texts. It was just understood that when you wrote a Christian text, you used the nomina sacra. It's interesting, though, to note that also that the nomina sacra occurs in letters. So when Christians would write letters to each other, they would include the nomina sacra when they referenced God, and it was a sign that it was the Christian God. It was a mark that this letter is a Christian letter. Because if you read letters in the Greco-Roman world, people writing, they're talking about God and their faith, you don't necessarily know whether it's, right off the surface, whether it's the Christian God, but when they use the nomina sacra, it was sort of the secret handshake of the ancient world for identifying yourself as a believer. It's pretty interesting. We have all kinds of what are called documentary papyri from Egypt that have the nomina sacra in it, from Christian letters. So this is a little bit of an introduction to the nomina sacra since we saw it first, and again, we'll be seeing this more and more as we go. All right, any questions on the first couple lines? All right, so we're in line 3 here. Who's up here, Ryan?
Sure.
So go from this middle point here, Kai, and let's go down to this middle point here, which ends with Phene.
Kai, chorus, agenata, hudin, ha, gagonin, alto, zoe, kai, he, zoe, hain, to, phos, ton, anthropon, kai, to, phos, and te, scotia, right?
Yep, and translation?
Right, sorry. And without him, nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light in the darkness shines.
Good. So this is the introduction to the language of light and darkness. On a theological level, we know that this is the reason that people see the prologue of John as an echo of Genesis. So if you think about it, the very opening line is, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and things were made through the Word. So this is like Genesis, right? It's placing Jesus in Genesis. And then you have the light shining in the darkness. Well, that sounds like Genesis. So you can see there's like a new beginning here, a new Genesis. But at the center of this, of course, is Christ. So here we are with Kai Choris, and without him, agenata uden. Nothing was made, which, gagonin, which was made. Let's parse gagonin there, Ryan.
Third singular perfect active indicative.
From?
Genomai?
Yeah, so same thing, right? Remember we talked about our author liking genomai. We had the aorist of it here, agenata, and then we have the perfect for it here, gagonin. You have that repeat of the gamma, that reduplication at the front, which tells you it's a perfect. So what you have here is nothing was made with him that was made. So there's a sense here is that it's sort of doubly saying it. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made which was made. So there's a lot of what sounds like repetition here, but it's a very strong emphasis on the way this is constructed. Couple things to note here. Did you notice any textual variations in this section, Ryan, when you did your sort of work?
Yes.
Okay.
Hudin.
Okay, what would you notice there?
Probably scribal error, if I had to guess, in the Nestle-Aland, it's Ude N.
Yeah, so in the Nestle-Aland here you have Ude N, which is sort of not one, right? Or not one thing. Okay, and then what our scribe did was just put unin, nothing. Okay, and what's your hypothesis, Ryan, for how that mistake came about?
The epsilon dropped out.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty interesting, right? So imagine our scribe was copying. Just look at the screen for a moment here. I'll zoom in on this. Imagine our scribe was saying, okay, copies E, U, D, E. So Uda, he copies from the exemplar in front of him. And then he goes back to put in N, and he already sees the E and thinks he may have already written it, and then writes the new. So he ends up dropping an E out accidentally. Pretty not surprising that that kind of mistake would happen. That kind of thing happens all throughout P66. The good thing here in this reading actually is it's not nonsensical. Sometimes when a mistake is made, it jumbles up the text in a way that is nonsensical. Here it still makes sense, which is probably why the mistake wasn't caught, right? When they go proofread it, because it still means the same thing, right? Nothing was made without him, which was made. Ha-gagonin here. Did you notice any other scribal errors, Ryan, on your?
I think.
And again, when we say scribal errors, we have to qualify ourselves, right? Because remember what I said earlier. It's probably the better way to put it is not scribal error, but variations from the text we have now. Because it could have been that he faithfully copied the text in front of him, right? So he didn't make a mistake. It's just the text he was copying already had the change in it. So we have to sort of assume that he made a mistake. But what else did you notice here?
I'm struggling deciphering my notes in retrospective at this way too late at night. But I think I marked a word that dropped out.
You're on the right track here. Who can help him? What word got dropped out?
Yeah. Right after it. Gagonin and.
Okay, so looking on the screen here, ha-gagonin, and then you have auto, okay? Missing in this spot is another N, okay? In the original Greek of the prologue, it says, that which has been made, ha-gagonin, and then in him was life, en auto. And Ryan, why do you think this N was dropped?
Probably just the same thing again. Missed catching the second N.
Yeah, so notice what the scribe would have had to write. He had to write ha-gagonin, and then you have to write N again. So you'd have N twice if he were copying it correctly. So what you'd end up having here, this is an interesting little analysis. So you got ha-gagonin, N, auto. Okay, this is the way the text should read. Okay, but you can see what the scribe does. He writes ha-gagonin, and then he looks at his exemplar and goes back and he sees this N. That's the ending of gagonin. And he assumes it's this N. So he ends up dropping that out and starts with auto. Okay. Now, once again, the good news here is, does that change the meaning of the text at all? Not really. And the reason is because doesn't auto in the dative already imply in? Right? Because this is in the dative. So you would already translate this as in him without this. So once again, a minor textual variation that doesn't really change the meaning of the text at all. Pausing on that for a moment, this is important for you to know that the type of variations we're seeing here, right? Sort of the Uda N versus Uden, or the Gagonin N versus just Gagonin, that type of thing. This is just the standard fair textual variations. So when guys like Bartram come around and say, wow, there's always mistakes and you can't know what the New Testament text says. No, you got to realize that the vast, vast majority of textual variations are just this sort of kind, okay? Which is that you've got a spelling change or a word order change or an ending change or an omission that's not nonsensical, that makes sense, that you can still follow what the text says and so on. And so just keep in mind that this is nothing sort of unusual going on in the scribal world. Okay, let me point out a couple other things I think is interesting here. So coming back up to our text, and I'll try to zoom it out here. So that which was made, and in him was life, and that life was ta phos, the light, tone, anthropon, right? That life was the light of men. Question for you, Ryan. Where's the noon at the end of this word, anthropo? Should be about right there.
Dropped off in the, yeah, because it's not on the next line either. I'm assuming it was in the margin dropped off.
Possible. I think what's going on here, interestingly, and again, I hope you can see it on the screen up front, is see this little horizontal line? This was a scribal feature where they would replace a noon with a horizontal line in the margin. We see this actually in your other folio too. So it would be anthropone, like that. So anthropone, and then you've got this noon here that would normally be there, and they draw a horizontal line over the top as a sign that it was there. This is just a scribal feature that's pretty common during manuscripts of this era. It's just a way of a sort of quickening their pace, ending the noon, and then starting on the next line. All right, so kaita phos, entos katia, so, and this light in the darkness shines, phene. Then notice here you have a little dot as a raised point for it here. Actually, I probably should have had you go to the end of the next line, but I'll have the next person do that and then continue on. Okay. So this is an interesting little segment here. It talks about the light shining in the darkness does not overcome it. There's some interesting little textual variations that are worth noting. Last parse here, Ryan, how do you parse phene here? That's an easy one.
Third singular, present active indicative.
Yeah, from pheno, shines. Okay, so Jesus is the light of the world, shines in the darkness. The darkness does not overcome it. This theme, as you know, is picked up later in the Gospel of John tons of times. The light-darkness theme is all over John, and it appears in the prologue. This is why I argue in my Gospels class that the prologue is sort of like a miniature table of contents, right? That it anticipates all the other themes that are coming. All right, so let's find out who's next here. Way up at Bar, is this you? All right, so Bar, I want you to finish this line here down to Katalaban. And then from there, why don't you go to Awanes right here, which I think is the beginning of a new verse. See where my cursor is? So again, read in Greek, then translate, and then we'll have a conversation about it.
Okay. Kai hes Gotia auto u katelaben. Genitor anthropos apostomenos para eu anima auto Ioannis. And the darkness did not receive it. There was a man, there was a man having been sent from God. The name to him was John.
All right, let's talk about this for a moment. So we're ending the initial part of the prologue here. Katai skotia, auta, and it, the darkness has not, kata laban. And how did you parse that again or translate that again?
I translated it, did not receive it.
Okay, so that's one possibility, kata laban. Let's parse kata laban for a moment first.
It's aorist active, indicative, third person singular.
Okay, from what word?
Katalambana.
All right, so obviously the darkness does not receive it sounds a little unusual. What might be some other options here?
One of the other ones that I saw was obtained.
Yeah, when we could just look to our English translations too. How do they translate it? Yeah, the darkness does not overcome it, right, or conquer it, or snuff it out would be an option here as well, and probably the better one given the context, because it's not so much the darkness didn't receive it, but didn't overwhelm it. I want you to notice something very interesting here at the end of this line, and that is this big space right here. Now, this is really unusual. You can maybe see it even better in the color photo. Of course, you have the color photo in here. Notice this space right here. Now, that type of scenario is very odd because you have a manuscript that is written with tight scriptio continua, and all of a sudden the scribe throws in this huge space and isn't going to write a word there and then starts on the next line. Or I'm going to give you first shot at this. What do you think's going on with that?
It looks like there's a major break in like the train of thought.
Mm-hmm.
That it's everything before it has kind of been one section, and then now because the next line is like there was a man named John, so it kind of changes setting.
Okay, so it's marking a transition in the account, right? In the flow of the story. So here's an interesting sort of backstory debate you may not be aware of. There's a long-standing debate about what counts as the prologue of John. Okay, we talk about the Johannine prologue. What is the Johannine prologue? What do we traditionally say is the Johannine prologue? As you have Gospels.
1 through 12?
No, not quite. A little longer.
1 through 18.
1 through 18, right? So we usually look at the first 18 verses and say that's the Johannine prologue. Yes, in some ways that could be the case. But notice what the scribe is telling us. He's telling us that the prologue is really this first section here. In his mind, that's the prologue, or at least the beginning of the Gospel of John. That's just an interesting little observation that in his mind, you have a new section beginning here that is worth noting.